If you ever are in the Cordova area, I hope you'll stop by the office and say hello. It'll be good to meet you in person. If you do come to my office, one of the things you're going to notice is that I have a wall full of languages because I am a self-confessed language nerd. Ever since I was in the 6th grade and I would go to school an hour early to get my Spanish teacher to teach me French, I have been fascinated by languages. I ended up majoring in French and German when I was in college, loved studying languages. Probably the craziest thing I ever did was to learn 10 hours of Greek and 10 hours of Hebrew in the same year in seminary. But one thing I learned when we got to India is learning a language on the field when your life depends on it is completely different than studying a language in a classroom for a grade. I learned the hard way the differences between some words. I went to the marketplace and asked for burra santra. I thought I was asking for a dozen oranges. I actually asked for spoiled oranges, and the lady was very happy to sell me all the spoiled oranges that she had. One time we went to get some drinks. It was our first week in the country. It was about 120 degrees out. We were on a walk and we were miserable, my wife and our 2 boys. And so we went and got some sodas, grabbed the bottles and started to walk off, and people were yelling at us in Telugu, a language we had no intention of learning. And it took about 15 minutes before they found an English speaker who could explain to us that we had bought the soda. We had not bought the bottles. We were not allowed to leave the kiosk until we had finished drinking our soda and gave them their bottles back. I was very excited when the day finally came that I understood a sentence that was spoken to me just in daily conversation. I had been out at the market, was coming into the little courtyard in front of our apartment, and a neighbor boy started looking at me and shaking his head in disgust because as it was raining, I was outside. And he looked at me and he said, "Hey, Angrezi, barish ho raha hai." Hey, Englishman, it's raining. Well, of course, I knew it was raining. You can know that no matter where you are if the water's hitting your head. But he said it to me in Urdu, and I understood every word. And it was a very exciting day. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about language learning. What are some good tips, how you can learn language on the field? Hopefully, you'll find it helpful. Selamat success. Selamat datang, khush hamdeed, and welcome to today's session on the importance of language learning as one of the contemporary strategies in missions. We're going to start by talking about why learn language. One of the most difficult but rewarding parts of my job while we were on the field was making sure that people learned language. Nothing is more likely to get a fellow missionary to hate you than to insist that he or she put in the hard work of learning a new language. But there are several reasons to really take the time necessary to become fluent, or at least to be able to comprehend what's happening around you in the local language. First of all, your job may actually depend on it. Every agency is different, of course, but many agencies, and the International Mission Board is one of them, will send people home who do not learn the language. They do not do this because they are mean or because they lack experience. 175 plus years of working across cultures around the world has taught the IMB and other agencies similarly that the most effective way to serve as a missionary is to be able to speak the language. And therefore, those who know value language learning. Actually, a second reason to really learn the language is your ability to stay and enjoy yourself may depend on it. In cases where mission agencies don't require a person to learn the language or make language learning optional, it has been noted that missionaries return to their country of origin much sooner, and usually with a sense of defeat, possibly even an animosity toward the people they served or missions in general. Living cross-culturally is difficult, and one of the most important elements in making it bearable and even enjoyable is being able to communicate. Learning the language means you can build relationships, share the gospel, make disciples, and have an active life, things that are much more difficult if you are trapped in the island of English speakers. Just a small story as an aside, once I was traveling in India with a fellow worker who refused to learn the language. He lived on a missionary compound, only used English. Well, one day we were at an airport and a man came up to us and tried to trick us into giving him money. I spoke to the man in Urdu and told him that we lived there and we knew what he was up to and we weren't going to give him any money. He asked me in Urdu, "Does your friend speak my language?" I said no, he didn't. And so he bet me that he could get money out of my friend, which he promptly did. Not long after that, that missionary resigned. And one of the reasons he gave was he didn't like the people that were always taking advantage of him. Now, I'm not guaranteeing you that if you learn language, no one will ever take advantage of you, but certainly you will have a better understanding of your environment, you will fit in better, you will make friends, and you'll just have a better experience personally and ministerially if you learn language. As a matter of fact, you're going to find that your success in ministry absolutely depends on learning language. People can communicate basic needs by pointing and grunting, smiling and gesturing, although even the meaning of gestures varies widely from place to place. But you will never really understand a people until you speak their heart language. And they will never really understand the gospel until they hear it in their heart language. An excellent biblical example of this is found during Paul's first missionary journey. It's a familiar story, but I'll read it for you. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leaped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the generations gone by he permitted all nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Now, there are a lot of lessons in this passage, but one thing you might notice is that the people were speaking the Lycaonian language. Paul and Barnabas were speaking the Greek language, and there was a great misunderstanding over what was actually happening. Language learning certainly would have made a difference in that setting. Of course, that wasn't Paul's purpose, as he was traveling through speaking and working mostly with Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek-speaking peoples. But the language problem there is clearly illustrated, and that's a problem that you have on the field. Lots of times people will raise their hand or make some kind of indication, but they haven't truly understood the gospel, and the missionary hasn't truly understood their questions. Empirical evidence actually backs this up. Here is a chart that is based on a survey of workers in the Islamic world. If you'll notice, it says the percentage of participants who saw faith communities established, we would say churches, for those who worked in the regional trade language with those who worked in the local language. Notice that when the missionary was content to work just in a regional trade language, over half of them saw no churches planted, and 40% saw one church planted while they were doing their work. However, people who took the time to learn the local language and minister in the local language, still about a quarter of them didn't see any results. 34% were able to see one church started, but many of them, 40% of them, saw multiple churches planted. They're just going to find more opportunity to share the gospel, make disciples, and plant churches when you speak the language of the people. So if it's so important, why do people fail to learn the language? In his article, 4 Reasons Missionaries Fail to Learn the Language, Carl Dahlfried noticed that there are 4 commonalities. One is over-spiritualizing. This is the result of assuming that God is obligated to use you no matter how little effort you put into learning the language. God is sovereign, that is true, but He expects us to do our part and use the brains He has given us. And just because He has called you to reach a people doesn't mean He's going to reach them through you if you don't learn language. Second reason is impatience. This is understandable. After having been discipled at church, studying through college and seminary, you finally arrive on the field. You don't want to wait a couple of years until you understand the language and culture. You want to start right away. But that is not going to prove effective. And underestimating the importance of language learning can really keep you from being effective. This is similar to the impatience issue. Some people do as little as possible to kind of quote-unquote pass out or test out of language study, meet some arbitrary requirement for employment, but not really put the work in needed to become effective. Sometimes people will do that so that they can stay on the field, but almost always they're going to find that their effectiveness has been limited. Of course, The missionary may come with every intention of learning language, fully committed, but lack opportunity. That could be the result of an agency policy. Many agencies don't provide language study or time for it. They don't value language study. It could be an issue of platform responsibilities. A missionary may need to jump right into a secular job that grants them a visa, or even the nature of their people group. That was the challenge we faced in our first assignment. Our target language was the fourth most widely spoken in our town, which means that 3 other languages were more likely to be spoken, and one of those languages was English. We rarely saw Urdu written in public or heard it used in many marketplaces. When we tried to speak, people would just say, "Oh, please just use English," because they spoke English better than they spoke Urdu. But in order to share with the people we had come to reach, we had to learn the language, and so we had to seek out those opportunities. They were not readily available to us. Which brings us to our next topic in learning language. How can we best learn language? Well, there are 3 philosophies of how to do language learning. Traditionally, the model was something like this. If this was your life on the field, there was the language learning, and then there was the ministry time. Traditionally, people would be sent to a language school, often in a city quite distant from where they were going to be serving, and when they reached a certain level of proficiency, they would pass out of language, they would test out of language, they would move to the field, and they would be allowed to start their work. Later on, people began something with like a growing participator approach. So at first, most of your time is spent in language, and little of your time is spent in ministry, but over time, you end up spending more time in ministry and less time in language. That's much better because right away you're getting involved and you're not communicating to the new missionary that they shouldn't be involved in evangelism, discipleship, and church planting until they reach a certain level of proficiency. But what we found was the most effective was something that looked like this. What I mean by that, Scribble, is that language is ministry, ministry is language. Rather than compartmentalizing your day into how many hours a day am I working on language learning, how many hours a day am I working on ministry, it's how can I use my language study as an opportunity to share the gospel. I'm learning how to share my testimony. I go out into the community and I'm actually practicing language, so it's a language event, but the way I'm practicing language is by sharing my testimony or sharing the gospel. Or in my quiet time, that's part of my own personal development, but I'm using a national language Bible, looking at a verse of scripture, and using ministry as language learning as ministry, combining the two together. Each of these philosophies can be used in different approaches or different methods of language learning. So let's consider some formal methods of language learning that may be available to you. The first would be an academic program. That would be like a high school or college language class. You take a class in your home country at a university. This method can be a good start, but it will teach you limited structures in a stilted format. It's not the same as actually learning to live and work in the language. It's not a bad thing to do. It's a good background preparation, but it's really not going to be the most effective way to get you speaking the language on the field. Nowadays, there are a lot of great computer programs that are available. More and more tools are being designed like Rosetta Stone that teach the language by immersion rather than by translation, meaning that instead of saying dog, chien, you actually see a picture of this animal, and in your headphones you hear chien. So you're associating the word with the image and not with the English word. Helps you develop fluency later on. I really recommend this style before you get to the field to begin putting the language into your mind. Of course, language schools are a great option in many places. Most language schools are not quite the same as those academic programs that you would take in an American university, because while you're at language school, you're living in the culture, you're living in the society, your teachers are native speakers, you're learning maybe from a textbook, but probably through conversation, through dialogue, through structured time, and through assignments that put you out into the community with a language group, meeting people daily and sharing language with them. Sometimes missionaries are sent to places where they're one of the first people to learn a language, and they may need to use the growing participator approach. The growing participator approach is a theory of language learning based on how children learn their first language. When a baby is learning English or whatever their mother tongue is going to be, they spend about a year just listening. And so in the growing participator approach, the first couple of months that you're in language, you're just listening to the teacher. The teacher is explaining things to you. You're hearing how the language sounds. You're not trying to write it down. You're not trying to reproduce it. You're just becoming acclimated to it. And then you grow in your participation in the use of that language. Final way to learn language is barefoot. Barefoot language can also be called glue. What that means is you don't have an instructor, you don't have a teacher, but you yourself find a person who speaks the language. You're going out barefoot, you're going out on your own to find someone who speaks the language, who can become a language guide for you, but you control the structure of the class. You control it through a process known as glue, which means get a text, get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sentences and some vocabulary. So you get the text, then you learn what you get. You listen over and over until you can say those sentences and understand those sentences and understand some answers that you might give to those sentences you might receive when you use them. So you get a text, you learn what you get, you use what you learn. You go out into the community and speak the language, and then you come back and evaluate what you used. Did I communicate? Did I understand how they communicated to me? There are many resources available to help someone learn in a barefoot style. The most popular of which is a book called LAMP, Language Acquisition Made Practical, which contains about 300 lessons, short texts that you would want to be able to communicate in your target language. Probably the best approach is going to be the one that works for you. Everyone is different. Some people need to understand the grammar. Some people just want to run out there and start talking right away. So adapt a program that best fits your personality. There are also a lot of informal ways to learning language, where language can just become a part of your daily life, whether you're in a school or barefoot or growing participator. I've already mentioned your devotional life. Start each day with a scripture verse that you are translating from your target language. Gradually begin to read more. Eventually try to use a devotional guide for children, and then start praying in that language, but include the language in your devotional life. Begin to play games. You can even start right away with your kids playing Uno to learn numbers and colors, then getting more complicated games. Going to the movies, listening to music, watching television, having the radio on while you're doing dishes. If possible, if you're watching a movie or a television, go ahead and use English subtitles at first. That's okay. You're beginning to understand how this language thing works. Later, switch to local language subtitles and you can begin to develop your reading skills. Watching the same program over and over again will actually help you begin to learn the language more quickly because you will understand what is being said. You can also use your hobbies in language learning. Do you like to play music? Join a band of people who only speak the target language. Take a cooking class. Become a member of a local gym. Whatever it is that you enjoy doing, find ways to do it in the language. This is a picture of the language learning levels identified by the ACTFL organization. ACTFL is a great way to look at language learning. There are a number of basic levels. Are you novice, intermediate, advanced, or superior in your language use? And then each of those are divided into low, mid, or high. Advanced low would be the stage at which a person would have enough language that it was like a giant sticky ball, and as you go out and about in your life, you're going to continue to pick up more language and continue to grow. So until a person reaches advanced low, you take them out of that language learning environment and they're going to lose everything they have. Once they get to advanced low, you take them out of formal language study, they're going to continue to improve until eventually, if they're conscientious, they will reach superior or distinguished. One of the good things about the ACTFL scale is that the testing isn't based on an academic test, it's based on competencies. There's not a fill in the blank, but it's a random conversation to see, does this person know the language well enough to use it in a real world setting? A novice, low to mid, might be able to produce a few words and phrases. By the time they get to intermediate high, perhaps they could tell stories about past events or keep a discourse in past tense for most of the time. Of course, by the time they reach superior, they're going to paraphrase, they're going to use other strategies to compensate for gaps in their lexical knowledge. There might still be errors present, but they do not distract from the content of the discourse. And so you're wanting to continually move up that chart. Whatever method you use as you're progressing in your competency with the language, there are some things that you can do that will help you to never give up. Talk, 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 talk. You will make mistakes, but if you don't talk, you won't learn. Keep trying. Create opportunities to be immersed in the language. Increase the amount of time as you grow in your understanding of the language so you do not get too frustrated. Like I say, start by watching a TV show, going to a movie, attend a worship service. After some time, plan for a day or even a week staying in a national's home with people who don't speak any of your heart language, and just surround yourself, force yourself to use the language. From the beginning, seek to express yourself directly in the language. Form an image in your mind of what you want to say, and then create the sentences in the native tongue. Don't form sentences in your native tongue and then translate them into your target language. Don't depend on interpreters. Frankly, most of the time, interpreters will get it wrong. I'll give you just a couple of stories about that. One time, a friend of ours was translating for an American, and the American said, "Oh, I've got deli belly." Well, deli belly is a slang term for diarrhea that American tourists use when they come to India. So he said, "Oh, I've got deli belly." Well, our Indian friend had no idea what deli belly was. He just thought that this man, who was rather overweight, must be saying that the food in India was so delicious that he had gotten fat. And so that's how he translated it. One time we asked a translator, "How did you learn English so well?" And he said, "Oh, by translating." We said, "What do you mean you learned English by translating?" He said, "Well, at first I didn't speak any English. And so I would translate and the preacher would say whatever he wanted to, and then I would say whatever I wanted to. But over time, I actually began to understand what they were saying." Sometimes the problem with a translator can be even more serious. There have been times when I've heard an American using a translator and the translator says exactly the opposite of what the speaker is trying to get across. Translators, not a good idea. Learning language, very difficult, but trust me, very, very worthwhile. Well, there you have it. There are several tips for you as you begin the journey of language learning when you get to the field, whether that's working with internationals in your own neighborhood and wanting to understand their language better, or if God has sent you to another country and you're going to be picking up language there. Hopefully the tips will be helpful for you and that they will help you learn to communicate the gospel in a new place, in a new way. God bless.